October 25, 1944. Off the coast of Samar Island, Philippines. 6:48 hours. The morning sun broke hesitantly through low-hanging clouds, casting pale light across a steel-gray sea that stretched endlessly in all directions. Aboard the USS Johnston, a Fletcher-class destroyer displacing barely 3,000 tons, the smell of coffee mingled with the acrid tang of fuel oil and the salt spray that misted across the deck. Commander Ernest Evans stood on the bridge, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he surveyed the calm waters of Leyte Gulf. Behind him, 6 escort carriers, the Jeep carriers, as the men called them, plodded northward at their sluggish maximum speed of 17 knots, their flight decks crowded with Wildcat fighters and Avenger torpedo bombers. These were the ships they called baby flat-tops, converted merchantmen with thin hulls and thinner armor, designed to ferry aircraft rather than face enemy warships. Around them, a protective screen of 6 other destroyers and destroyer escorts traced careful patterns through the water, their tin can hulls barely a quarter-inch thick in most places, their crews eating breakfast and writing letters home, believing the great naval battles of the Pacific War had already been fought and won. Then, at exactly 6 minutes to 7, a lookout's voice shattered the morning calm. Through the haze on the northern horizon, dark shapes began to materialize. Not the familiar silhouettes of American battleships returning from the Surigao Strait, but something else entirely. Something massive, something that should not have been there. The pagoda-like superstructures rose first into view, followed by the enormous hulls of battleships displacing more than 70,000 tons each. Their 16-inch guns capable of throwing shells the weight of small automobiles more than 25 miles. Behind them came heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and destroyers. 23 warships in all, the most powerful surface strike force the Imperial Japanese Navy could still muster. Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, thought to have been crippled and turned back the previous day, had instead navigated the treacherous waters of San Bernardino Strait during the night and emerged precisely where American planning had assumed no enemy fleet could be. Between these capital ships and the defenseless escort carriers stood only 7 destroyers and destroyer escorts, the expendable tin cans, the ships that serious naval officers barely considered worthy of the name warship. The Japanese lookouts aboard the battleship Yamato could barely contain their satisfaction as they identified the American vessels through their optical rangefinders. They had found what they believed to be the main American carrier force, the fat prizes that would justify every sacrifice of the long war. What they saw through their binoculars were flight decks and the low profiles of carriers, and they assumed these were the fast fleet carriers that had ravaged Japanese naval aviation for 3 years. They did not yet realize they were looking at Kaiser-built escort carriers, slow merchantmen fitted with flight decks, ships whose greatest contribution to the war effort would be measured not in combat victories, but in ferrying replacement aircraft to island bases. And between the great battleships of the Yamato class and these seemingly helpless carriers stood only a handful of destroyers, ships the Japanese naval doctrine had designated as essentially disposable, useful for torpedo runs and little else, certainly not capable of standing in pitched battle against capital ships. In the Japanese naval hierarchy, destroyers were called kuchikuken, literally destroyers. But they were treated as expendable weapons, single-purpose vessels that would sacrifice themselves to deliver one torpedo spread before being blown out of the water. The Americans built them the same way, with hulls so thin that a man could punch through them with a sledgehammer, engines that could drive them to 35 knots but left them vibrating like tuning forks, and armament that seemed almost comical compared to the massive guns of battleships. A destroyer's 5-inch guns, respectable enough for shore bombardment or anti-aircraft work, appeared pathetic against the armor of capital ships, like a man armed with a pocket knife facing an opponent in full medieval plate armor. This morning, the Japanese fully expected those tin cans to behave exactly as doctrine prescribed, launch their torpedoes from maximum range, lay smoke, and flee at flank speed while the real warships, the battleships and cruisers, closed to finish the massacre of the American carriers. What the Japanese did not expect, what their naval doctrine had never contemplated, what their cultural understanding of warfare had never prepared them for, was that these American tin cans would charge. To understand the shock that would unfold in the waters off Samar, one must first understand the vast gulf that separated Japanese and American naval philosophy in the autumn of 1944. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been built on the bones of samurai tradition, on the concept of kantai-kessen, the decisive fleet, engagement where battleships would meet in climactic confrontation, and the superior spirit and training of Japanese crews would overcome any material disadvantage. Japanese destroyers existed to support this grand vision, serving as scouts, screening vessels, and one-time torpedo platforms that would harry the enemy battle line before the great guns spoke. They were crewed by men trained to accept death as the natural conclusion of combat, to view survival as almost shameful if it came at the cost of failing one's duty. Japanese destroyer captains studied the Battle of Tsushima, where Admiral Togo had destroyed the Russian Baltic Fleet in 1905, and they memorized the correct distance to launch torpedoes, the proper formation to maintain, the exact moment to turn away after firing and let the battleships complete the work. The American Navy had built its destroyer force on entirely different principles. American destroyers were products of industrial democracy, mass-produced in shipyards from Bath, Maine to San Francisco, California, built by workers who had been farmers and shopkeepers and students just months before. The Fletcher-class destroyers that formed the backbone of the American destroyer force by 1944 were designed for versatility rather than singular purpose. They carried depth charges for anti-submarine warfare, 5-inch guns for surface combat and anti-aircraft defense, torpedo tubes for attacking capital ships, and radar systems that gave them eyes in darkness and fog. They were ships that reflected American pragmatism, built to do many jobs adequately rather than one job perfectly. More importantly, they were commanded by men who had been taught to think independently, to adapt to circumstances, to make decisions without waiting for orders from the flagship. American naval officers attended classes at Annapolis where they studied leadership and initiative, where they were graded not just on following the textbook solution, but on finding creative alternatives when the textbook didn't apply. This cultural difference between rigid adherence to doctrine and flexible innovation would prove decisive in the chaos about to unfold. But there was another, deeper difference that the Japanese could not yet perceive. By October 1944, the American destroyers off Samar represented something unprecedented in naval history. They were the product of a fully mobilized industrial democracy fighting a war it believed was existentially just. Every man aboard these ships had grown up in a nation where he could vote, where he could speak freely, where he could choose his own path in life. They had joined the Navy not because they were conscripted or because honor demanded it, but because they believed their cause was righteous, stopping fascism, avenging Pearl Harbor, protecting a way of life that valued individual dignity and freedom. This belief gave them something the Japanese did not expect, a willingness to sacrifice not from fatalistic acceptance of death, but from active choice, from the conviction that some things were worth dying for not because Bushido demanded it, but because freedom required it. The irony was perfect and terrible. The Japanese, who had built their entire military culture around the nobility of sacrifice, were about to face American sailors who would choose to sacrifice themselves not from obedience but from conviction, not from the weight of tradition but from the lightness of free choice. The tin cans were about to teach the Imperial Navy a lesson about the difference between dying because you must and dying because you choose to, between following orders unto death and choosing to stand and fight when any rational calculation said you should run. At 06:59 hours, the battle began with the flash of guns 20 miles away, and within seconds, enormous geysers of water erupted around the American formation as Japanese shells the size of telephone poles plunged from the sky. These were not the relatively light 8-inch rounds from cruisers, but the massive 18-inch shells from Yamato herself, each one weighing nearly 3,000 pounds, capable of penetrating 2 feet of hardened steel armor. They fell among the escort carriers like the fists of angry gods, and each splash sent up columns of water taller than the carriers' masts, drenching the flight decks and sending shudders through the thin hulls. The carriers began launching every aircraft they had, pilots scrambling to their cockpits without proper briefings, some planes taking off without full ammunition loads, a few without any ammunition at all, because getting airborne meant survival and staying on deck meant certain destruction. Commander Evans on the Johnston made his decision in the space of a single breath. He did not call a conference of officers. He did not radio for instructions from the task unit commander aboard one of the carriers. He looked at the massive Japanese fleet bearing down on the helpless escort carriers, calculated the minutes until those great ships would be in point-blank range, and gave the order that would define the next 2 hours. All engines ahead flank. Comment smokescreen. All hands to battle stations. We're going in. The Johnston heeled hard to port, her engines roaring to full power. Black smoke pouring from her stacks as she accelerated to 35 knots and turned directly toward the Japanese fleet. Alone. A 3,000-ton destroyer charging 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The men on the other American destroyers watched in stunned silence for perhaps 10 seconds. Then, without orders from higher command, without coordinated planning, the other destroyers of Taffy 3's screen, Howell, Heerman, and the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, Dennis John C. Butler, and Raymond turned and followed. 7 tin cans, their combined displacement less than that of a single Japanese battleship, charging the most powerful surface force in the Pacific. It was not doctrine. It was not tactics. It was not even particularly sane. But it was the only chance the escort carriers had, and every man on those destroyers knew it. The Japanese officers on the bridge of Yamato watched this development with genuine confusion. Their doctrine included many scenarios for how a destroyer screen might defend carriers. Long-range torpedo attacks followed by withdrawal, smoke screens to provide cover for the carriers to escape, perhaps a few destroyers sacrificing themselves while the rest preserved their strength. But this? A frontal assault straight at the main battle line with no attempt to maneuver for advantage or preserve escape routes? It violated every principle of naval warfare they had studied. For a moment, some Japanese officers wondered if the American destroyers were attempting to ram, a desperation tactic that would be suicidal but might damage a battleship's hull. Others theorized the Americans were laying mines, though no one could imagine how destroyers would deploy mines while charging at flank speed. The simpler explanation, that the Americans were attacking with guns and torpedoes intending to fight it out against impossible odds, seemed too absurd to contemplate. Destroyers did not challenge battleships to gun duels. It would be like a man with a pistol challenging a tank, but the Johnston was already firing. Her 5-inch guns, designed primarily for anti-aircraft work and shore bombardment, opened up at a range of 16,000 yards, hurling 40-pound shells at the towering superstructure of the heavy cruiser Kumano. The shells were absurdly small compared to the massive armor of Japanese capital ships. A 5-inch round carried perhaps 10 pounds of explosive, nothing compared to the hundreds of pounds in a battleship's shells. But Commander Evans had trained his gunnery crews relentlessly, and they fired with devastating accuracy, walking their shells up the cruiser's superstructure, smashing radar arrays, destroying rangefinders, killing officers on the open bridge. The Kumano staggered under the assault. Not from damage to her armored hull, the 5-inch shells bounced off or fragmented against her heavy plates, but from the systematic destruction of her ability to direct fire. Rangefinders shattered, radio antennas collapsed. The forward fire control position erupted in flames. Then the Johnston closed to 10,000 yards and launched her full spread of 10 torpedoes, the long lance weapons arcing through the water at 46 knots, their wakes cutting white lines across the gray sea. The Japanese had invented the long lance torpedo, and they knew its capabilities perfectly. They knew the effective range, the speed, the warhead's devastating power. But they had not expected American destroyers to close to suicide range before launching, had not anticipated that the Americans would sacrifice any hope of escape to guarantee their torpedoes would hit. The Kumano's captain, watching the torpedo wakes racing toward his ship, ordered emergency maneuvers, but the heavy cruiser was already turning to avoid the shells raining down on her superstructure, and she could not evade both threats. 3 torpedoes struck her bow in rapid succession, and the explosions tore away the cruiser's entire forward section. The Kumano shuddered to a halt, her bow gone, taking water effectively out of the battle. A 10,000-ton heavy cruiser, mounting 10 8-inch guns disabled by a destroyer that weighed less than a third of her displacement. This was not supposed to be possible. The mathematics of naval warfare were clear and inflexible. Big ships beat small ships, heavy guns beat light guns, armor beat speed. A destroyer might get lucky with a torpedo hit, but to close to point-blank range, engage with guns, launch torpedoes, and survive to continue fighting. Japanese naval doctrine had no category for this outcome. It was as if the universe had momentarily suspended its physical laws. But the Johnston was not finished. Instead of turning away after launching her torpedoes as every manual prescribed, she continued charging into the Japanese formation, her guns still firing, now engaging a light cruiser at 6,000 yards. Her shells at this range could penetrate lighter armor, and they walked across the cruiser's waterline, punching through plating, starting fires, killing crew. The light cruiser turned away, laying smoke, seeking to escape this maniacal destroyer that fought like a battleship. Behind the Johnston, the other destroyers pressed their own attacks. The whole charged the battleship Congo, firing over 205-inch rounds in 40 minutes of continuous combat. Her guns so hot they had to be cooled with seawater, her crew serving the weapons in a frenzy of controlled desperation. The Heermann engaged multiple heavy cruisers simultaneously, her captain threading between Japanese ships with such aggressive maneuvering that one Japanese destroyer, attempting to close for torpedo range, nearly collided with a friendly cruiser. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, armed with only a single 5-inch gun and 3 torpedo tubes, pushed through the Japanese line to launch her torpedoes at point-blank range. Her gun crew firing so rapidly that the barrel glowed red, the paint blistering and peeling away in the heat. These were not warships in any traditional sense. They were floating gun platforms crewed by men who had decided that death was preferable to letting the Japanese reach the carriers. The Japanese response, after the initial confusion, was overwhelming and systematic. Once Admiral Kurita realized the American carriers were not the fast fleet carriers he had expected, but merely escort carriers, and that the desperate attack by the destroyers was not some brilliant tactical maneuver, but simple suicidal determination, he ordered his entire force to engage and destroy the impudent tin cans. The Yamato trained her massive 18-inch guns on the Johnston, and when they fired, the shells passed so close overhead that the blast wave knocked men off their feet. The geysers from near misses rose 300 feet into the air, and when the shells struck water, they sent shock waves through the sea that could kill a man through concussion alone if he were swimming nearby. The Johnston wove and twisted, laying smoke, changing speed and direction unpredictably, and by some miracle none of the Yamato's shells struck her directly. Though near misses shredded her hull with splinters and fragments, her after-engine room took damage from a near miss, and her speed dropped to 25 knots, then 20. But she continued fighting. The heavy cruisers Haguro, Tone, and Shikuma formed a column and began systematic fire on the American destroyers, their 8-inch guns tracking targets with professional precision. The whole took the first catastrophic hits, 8-inch shells punching through her thin hull, exploding inside her engine spaces, tearing through crew compartments. Her forward gun mounts were destroyed, then her bridge, then her steering gear. She continued firing with her remaining guns even as she lost power, even as she began to list, her crew serving weapons manually because the electrical fire control was gone. When she finally capsized and sank, she had taken over 40 direct hits from shells ranging from 5 to 14 inches in caliber, and she had been firing her guns until the moment the water reached them. The Samuel B. Roberts fought for nearly 2 hours before the accumulated damage became unsurvivable. She had been hit by multiple 8-inch shells, her thin hull torn open in a dozen places, her forward magazine flooded to prevent explosion, her stern blown almost completely off by a massive hit near the waterline. But her single 5-inch gun continued firing, the crew loading and firing by hand when the power died, the gun captain calling corrections even as Japanese shells screamed overhead and the deck beneath his feet began to buckle. When the order finally came to abandon ship, when it was clear she could no longer float, some of her crew wept. Not from fear of death in the water, but from rage at having to stop fighting. They had believed, truly believed, that their tiny destroyer escort could hold off cruisers and battleships if only they fought hard enough, if only they refused to yield. The mathematics of steel and explosives said otherwise, but they had given the carriers precious minutes to escape, and they went into the water singing the Star-Spangled Banner. The Johnston, having absorbed punishment that should have sunk her an hour earlier, finally lost her ability to maneuver. A 14-inch shell from the battleship Congo struck her bridge, killing most of the officers present, wounding Commander Evans grievously. More 8-inch shells tore through her engineering spaces and her engines finally ground to a halt. Dead in the water, unable to run, unable even to turn to bring her few remaining guns to bear, She continued to float for another 20 minutes, a testament to American damage control training and the stubborn refusal of her crew to sink. Japanese destroyers closed to finish her with torpedoes, and as she began her final plunge, a Japanese destroyer captain, an officer who had fought through 4 years of war, who had seen countless ships destroyed, ordered his crew to line the rails and salute. Whatever the Johnston had been, outgunned, outmatched, ridiculously overmatched, she had fought with a courage that transcended nationality. The Japanese captain knew what it meant to face death without flinching, and he recognized in the Johnston's crew the same quality his own navy valued above all else. But there was something more, something he could not quite name. The Americans had chosen this. They had not been ordered to sacrifice themselves by a flag officer safe on a distant ship. They had charged of their own accord, each captain making his own decision, and that difference meant something profound that the Japanese officer did not yet understand. While the tin cans fought their desperate battle, the escort carriers ran southward at their maximum speed of 17 knots, launching aircraft continuously. Every plane that could fly, armed or not, experienced pilot or not. The Wildcat fighters and Avenger torpedo bombers swarmed over the Japanese fleet like angry hornets, strafing, dropping bombs when they had them, making dry runs when they didn't, anything to distract the Japanese gunners, to force the big ships to maneuver, to buy one more minute for the carriers to escape. Some pilots, having expended all their ammunition, flew repeated strafing runs with empty guns, hoping the Japanese wouldn't realize they were harmless. One pilot, Lieutenant Paul Garrison, ran out of ammunition early in the battle and then proceeded to make over 30 attack runs on Japanese ships, diving at them again and again, hoping to draw fire away from the carriers. He survived the battle and later admitted he had expected to die on every single run but couldn't think of anything else useful to do except keep diving. The combination of the destroyer attack and the continuous air harassment threw Admiral Kurita's force into confusion. The carefully planned approach dissolved into a series of individual ship actions, with each Japanese captain maneuvering to avoid torpedoes, dodge air attacks, and return fire at targets that kept disappearing into smokescreens. The Yamato, the most powerful battleship ever built, spent 20 minutes running away from what lookouts reported as a massive torpedo spread, a spread that turned out to be the wakes of her own escort destroyers, misidentified in the smoke and chaos. The heavy cruiser Suzuya took a bomb hit from an Avenger and had to drop out of formation, her speed reduced to 20 knots. The cruiser Chokai was struck by an aircraft torpedo and left dead in the water, to be scuttled later by her own destroyers. The systematic execution of the American carriers that Admiral Kurita had envisioned turned into a confused melee where his ships were taking damage from weapons that shouldn't have been able to hurt them. 5-inch destroyer guns, light aircraft bombs, torpedoes from lumbering Avengers that should have been easy targets for anti-aircraft fire. By 09:20 hours, Admiral Kurita made his fatal decision. Looking at the reports flooding his flagship, 3 heavy cruisers damaged or sinking, several destroyers hit, continuous air attacks, and the ferocious resistance from ships he had expected to sweep aside, he concluded that he must have stumbled into the main American fast carrier force. The tenacity of the destroyer defense, the volume of air attacks, the coordination of the American response, all suggested this was a major fleet engagement against first-line units. He did not know that the destroyers were charging not from confidence but from desperation, that the aircraft were attacking with whatever weapons they happened to have loaded, because there was no time for proper arming, that the entire American force was improvising madly, because they had been caught completely by surprise. All Kurita knew was that he had been ordered to destroy American carriers, that he had lost the element of surprise, that his force was being damaged by unexpected resistance, and that somewhere out there might be American fast battleships racing to cut off his retreat. He ordered his fleet to turn north and withdraw through San Bernardino Strait, the most powerful surface force Japan could still muster. Within 20 minutes of destroying the escort carriers and potentially changing the entire strategic situation in the Philippines, turned and ran from tin cans and jeep carriers. The Americans could barely believe what they were seeing. From the bridge of the carrier Fanshawe Bay, Captain Douglas Johnson watched through binoculars as the Japanese heavy ships turned away, their pagoda superstructures shrinking into the smoke and distance. His carrier had taken 6 hits from 8-inch shells, her hull torn and burning, but she was still afloat, still making headway, and the enemy was leaving. Around him, officers stared in stunned silence. They had been writing mental farewell letters, had been preparing to die, had watched the destroyers charge to certain death, and now the Japanese were retreating. It made no sense. The mathematics hadn't changed. The Japanese still had overwhelming firepower. The carriers were still nearly defenseless. The destroyers that remained were battered and low on ammunition. But the enemy was leaving. On the few American destroyers still afloat and capable of movement, exhausted crews collapsed at their stations, too spent for celebration, barely able to process survival. The Heermann, her hull so riddled with holes that she should have sunk hours ago, wallowed in the swells, her pumps working frantically to keep water out of her damaged compartments. The Dennis and John C. Butler, both destroyer escorts, circled slowly, picking up survivors from the sunken ships, pulling men from the oil-slicked water where they had been swimming for hours among sharks and floating debris. Many survivors, when hauled aboard rescue ships, asked immediately what had happened to the battle, whether the carriers had escaped, and when told that the Japanese had withdrawn, they wept, not from relief at their own survival, but from something more complex, a mixture of grief for their lost shipmates and pride that their sacrifice had meant something, that the desperate charge of the tin cans had actually worked. What the Japanese could not see, what their doctrine had never accounted for, was that the American destroyers off Samar represented something entirely new in naval warfare. Ships crewed by men who believed they were fighting for something larger than honor or obedience. Every sailor on those destroyers had grown up in a nation where he could speak his mind, where he could vote for his leaders, where he could choose his own path in life. They had joined the fight not because tradition demanded it, not because refusal would bring shame on their families, but because they believed fascism was wrong and democracy was worth defending. This belief, this conviction born of free choice rather than imposed duty, gave them a peculiar kind of courage that the Japanese, who had built their entire culture around the nobility of sacrifice, could not quite comprehend. The Japanese sailors were willing to die for the emperor because their culture gave them no choice but to be willing. The American sailors chose to die for their shipmates and their cause, and that difference, subtle but fundamental, changed everything. In the weeks following the battle off Samar, as the full scope of the engagement became clear, American naval analysts struggled to understand what had actually happened. By every calculation, by every principle of naval warfare, Taffy 3 should have been annihilated. Admiral Kurita's center force had possessed overwhelming superiority in firepower, armor, speed, and numbers. The American escort carriers had been caught in the worst possible position, with no support from battleships or fast carriers, with only a thin screen of destroyers for protection. The correct outcome, the outcome that every tactical manual predicted, was the destruction of the American force with minimal Japanese losses. Instead, 3 American destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, fighting for approximately 2 hours, had so disrupted and damaged the Japanese fleet that Admiral Kurita believed he was facing major American fleet units and withdrew. The official U.S. Navy action report, written weeks later, concluded with an unusual admission. The American victory could not be adequately explained by tactical analysis alone. Something else had been present in the battle, some quality that the equations of firepower and tonnage could not capture. The Japanese analysts, conducting their own post-battle reviews, reached a different conclusion, but one that troubled them deeply. The American destroyers had fought with a determination that matched or exceeded anything Japanese forces had displayed throughout the war. But whereas Japanese sacrifice was expected, was coded into the very structure of their military culture, the American sacrifice appeared voluntary, almost casual, as if the destroyer crews had weighed their options and decided that charging battleships made perfect sense. This voluntarism, this absence of fatalism, suggested a kind of soldier the Japanese had not encountered before. Men who would die for their cause not because they had been conditioned to accept death, but because they had chosen to risk it. The implications were disturbing. If American soldiers could match Japanese determination without requiring the rigid indoctrination and harsh discipline that Japanese forces considered essential, if democracy could produce warriors as dedicated as those shaped by Bushido, Then perhaps the entire foundation of Japanese military superiority was illusory. Perhaps free men fighting for a cause they believed in were actually more dangerous than conscripts fighting for honor and obedience. In the aftermath of the battle, as the escort carriers limped toward safety and rescue vessels searched the waters for survivors, individual stories began to emerge that illustrated the depth of conviction that had driven the American sailors. Pharmacist's mate, second class Robert C. Hardin, aboard the Samuel B. Roberts, had stayed below deck during the entire battle, treating the wounded in the ship's tiny aid station even as shells tore through the hull around him. When the order came to abandon ship, he helped wounded sailors into life raft and then went back into the sinking destroyer to search for anyone left behind. He made 3 trips into the flooding compartments before the ship's list became too severe, and on his final trip out, he carried a badly wounded sailor on his back up a ladder that was nearly vertical. When asked later why he had risked his life repeatedly for men who were likely to die anyway from their wounds, he seemed genuinely confused by the question. "They were my shipmates," he said, as if that explained everything. And perhaps it did. The bonds formed aboard these small ships, where every man knew every other man's name and hometown and girlfriend's photograph, created a sense of family stronger than any military regulation could mandate. Commander Ernest Evans, the captain of the Johnston, survived his ship sinking but died in the water hours later from his wounds. Survivors reported that he remained conscious almost until the end, floating in his life jacket, encouraging nearby sailors, telling them to keep swimming, keep believing rescue would come. He told one young sailor who was giving up hope that American destroyers never surrendered, that the Johnston had never struck her colors, that they had fought to the last shell and the last breath, and that was all any sailor could do. When Evans finally slipped below the surface, several sailors tried to dive down to save him, but he was gone, and they clung to debris in the oil-slicked water and sang hymns because it was the only thing they could think to do that seemed adequate to honor him. Evans had been one of the first Native Americans to command a U.S. Navy warship, a Cherokee who had reached the pinnacle of his profession through merit and determination, and he had taken his ship into combat with a ferocity that stunned even his own crew. Before the battle, he had told his officers that the Johnston would fight until she could no longer fight, and he had kept that promise absolutely. The rescue operations took 3 days, complicated by sharks, by survivors scattered across miles of ocean, by wounds and exhaustion and exposure. Men floated in groups, tied together with rope so they wouldn't drift apart, taking turns sleeping while others watched for rescue ships. Some groups sang to keep their spirits up, working through every patriotic song they knew, then popular songs, then any song anyone could remember the words to. One group of survivors from the hole spent hours debating baseball statistics, arguing about whether Ted Williams or Joe DiMaggio was the better hitter, because focusing on something normal in peacetime helped them believe they would survive to see another baseball season. When rescue ships finally found them, some men were so weak they had to be lifted aboard in cargo nets, too exhausted to climb rope ladders. Others, still strong enough to move, refused to leave the water until they were certain no living sailor remained behind. The destroyers and escort carriers searching for survivors swept back and forth through the battle area for days, picking up men one by one or in small groups, and every sailor rescued came aboard and immediately asked whether the Japanese had gotten the carriers, whether the sacrifice of the tin cans had mattered. When told that the escort carriers had escaped, that the Japanese had withdrawn, many survivors broke down, unable to process the magnitude of what they had accomplished. The symbolic weight of the tin can, that derisive nickname for destroyers, suggesting something cheap and disposable, took on new meaning after Samar. These were ships that the Japanese had dismissed as negligible threats, vessels that existed to be used up and expended in torpedo runs before the real warships settled the battle. But off Samar, the tin cans had done something unprecedented. They had stopped a battle fleet. Not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through sheer determination, through the willingness of their crews to charge into certain death, because their cause demanded it and their conscience accepted no other course. The thin steel hulls, barely thick enough to keep out the sea, had held men whose courage was anything but thin, and the Japanese, who had believed courage was their unique cultural possession, that Bushido gave them an advantage no enemy could match, had discovered that free men could be just as brave as samurai, and perhaps more dangerous because their bravery came from choice rather than conditioning. American industrial capacity, that great advantage that would eventually crush Japanese resistance through sheer weight of materiel, had been secondary at Samar. The destroyers that charged the center force were not superior ships. They were actually less capable individually than Japanese destroyers, less heavily armed, less robustly built. What made them effective was not their steel or their engines or their weapons, but their crews. Men who had been raised in a culture that valued individual initiative and independent thought, who had been trained to adapt rather than follow rigid procedures, who believed deeply that their cause was just and worth any sacrifice. This combination of factors, industrial production capacity wedded to democratic values, technological competence married to moral conviction, created a military force that the Japanese had not anticipated. They had expected Americans to be soft, made weak by democratic indulgence and material comfort. They had expected American sailors to surrender when faced with overwhelming odds, to calculate survival chances and act rationally by fleeing. What they encountered off Samar was the opposite. Men who chose to fight because surrender was unthinkable, who charged into certain death because protecting the carriers was more important than personal survival, who made split-second decisions to disobey tactical doctrine because the situation demanded improvisation. The philosophical implications troubled Japanese strategists throughout the remaining months of the war. If the Americans could produce sailors as willing to sacrifice themselves as Japanese sailors, if democracy could generate the same dedication as imperial militarism, then the entire premise of Japanese cultural superiority became questionable. The battle off Samar suggested that individual freedom, far from weakening soldiers, might actually strengthen them by giving them something genuine to fight for, rather than an abstraction like national honor. The men aboard the Johnston, Hull, Heermann, and Samuel B. Roberts had not charged the Japanese fleet because they feared court-martial if they fled, or because their culture would shame them for surviving, or because they had been indoctrinated from childhood to view death in battle as glorious. They charged because they looked at the situation, made their own choice, and decided that saving the carriers was worth dying for. That voluntary quality, that element of personal decision, made their sacrifice more powerful precisely because it had not been compelled. The battle off Samar receded into the larger narrative of the Pacific War, overshadowed by the larger fleet actions at Leyte Gulf, by the subsequent invasion of the Philippines, by the eventual capture of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and the atomic bombs and the surrender. But for those who studied it closely, for the naval historians who would later write detailed accounts of the destroyer action off Samar, the battle represented something unique in naval history, the only instance where destroyers, through courage and determination alone, turned back a battle fleet. Not through surprise torpedo attack under cover of darkness, not through minefields or submarines or air power, but through direct assault in daylight, trading shell for shell with ships that outgunned and outweighed them by factors of 10 or 20. The men who survived Samar carried the memory of that morning for the rest of their lives, and many struggled to articulate what they had experienced. They had seen friends die, had watched their ships torn apart by shells against which they had no defense, had floated in the Pacific for hours or days, waiting for rescue that might never come. But they had also experienced something profound and rare, the knowledge that they had faced the ultimate test and not been found wanting, that they had been given a choice between survival and duty, and had chosen duty without hesitation. That knowledge, that certainty of having acted rightly when everything was on the line, sustained them through decades of peacetime life. They had been ordinary men, farm boys and city kids, high school graduates and college dropouts, guys who liked baseball and